You're listening to episode 716 of a VerySpatial podcast, June 25th, 2023.
Hello and welcome to our VerySpatial podcast. I'm Jesse.
I'm Sue.
I'm Barb.
And this is Frank.
And this week we're going to be talking about some things that came from last week's discussion about AI and VR and AR that was part of the recent announcements. And I want to have a little idea of where we could take some of that conversation. But first, of course, we have some news. First of this week, China has had more recent launches. And in these launches, you have a combination of things. First, you have a new backup satellite that's part of the BeiDou. Anybody else want to re-say it?
I think I was told it's BeiDou, but I could be
wrong. Let's see. I've heard it multiple ways, and I actually had an ex-colleague of mine who's originally Chinese. Well, he still is Chinese, just trying to become American. I think Sue's got it right, if I remember, because I asked him that.
I was scolded by a Chinese student. Yeah.
Okay.
So when I said it wrong.
BeiDou.
Yeah.
Has launched a new backup satellite. So that launched recently. In addition, you also had a launch of a couple of SAR satellites. One is kind of a workhorse SAR satellite, and in addition, Wuhan University also launched a SAR satellite that's being used to test the Ka band and looking at various uses, both remote sensing and meteorological, for this. So, a few satellites going up recently as China continues with its aggressive launch schedule.
Yes, they continue to have a ambitious, and they mostly go through with those launches per year. But I think the SAR thing is interesting because, we talked about on the podcast, lots of others were kind of looking at as commercial entities embrace more of remotely sensed data in wavelengths outside of true color and other technologies. SAR was one of the next things that, it seemed like it had some room to grow in terms of applications and some updating the technology. So interesting to see that.
Yeah.
So the U.S. NIST, National Institutes of Standards and Technology, has announced that they have a new approach for ultra-precise timing links to geosynchronous satellites. And this new approach would link optical atomic clocks around the globe in an ultra-precise manner that has a lot better fidelity. The fidelity now is great, but this would basically very much increase the types of measurements and range that they have from current methods.
I know, it's already amazingly precise, and I have to say that femtosecond was something that I had never heard of. But 10,000 times better than existing state-of-the-art approaches, right? Which are already really good. So it's just amazing.
The current ones are radio-based, if I understand correctly. Correctly.
Obviously there's always room to do it, but just 10,000 times better.
But this is using, instead of that, existing ground-based station syncing up clocks using these radio signals whenever the GPS satellites go over the ground stations. This would take advantage of, as optical suggests, using light-based standards to be able to push this much faster. So you're not dealing with the same speed of the radio signal. You have a much faster speed of light.
And I like how they also threw in there, and it might contribute to testing general relativity, right?
Because GPS didn't do that enough on its own.
Yeah.
I was thinking that yet something else that, satellites are going to be doing for all of us, which makes them very critical, but also how many can we have up there and, how do we decide what they do? Because time is very important.
Yeah. And this was tested on point to point. And so, they're looking at, the people at NIST are looking at this. Again, it's not for now. It's definitely something they're looking at in the future, but looking at how it can be used with something mobile, as satellites are that are moving, and those type of things. So it's a step towards what we could be moving to in the future.
Speaking of things we can move into the future, I just thought this was a really cool thing, so I put it in the news. This idea of Saildrones. So The notion of water-based drones, ships out there as drones doing their thing autonomously, is not new. I think we've been talking about water-based drones for upwards of a decade. But this is the first time I've ever really heard of a sailboat-based one. So they've got like 3 platforms they can do with this company called Saildrones, and they put out basically a sailboat, and it has up to, I think, 15 sensors they can put on there. Right now, it's being used by NOAA specifically for Arctic mapping, but they could be used in all sorts of contexts. They talk about they could be sent into hurricanes to figure out what's going on with a hurricane, where we normally couldn't put a piece of equipment. Or we'd worry about them running out of fuel or something like that. So, sailboats are arguably the oldest form of ocean-going technology known to mankind, and I just think it's a really cool hybrid to stick this up with drones and autonomous and data collection round the clock.
And that's another one where when you read about it and you see the footage, like, it makes total sense, but it's just another thing too that you can see lots of applications for, but so much of the drone development was, kind of to follow flight type of instruments and sensors and stuff. And there's lots of things on the ground, the surface level of the ocean, right? That you mentioned the hurricane thing and hurricane flights that we use. And we also have buoys and other things to get data, but having something on the surface that can go in will get often very different measurements and different kinds of data than what they have to get from airborne platforms. So, just one example of how to do that. But now we can see our drones plying the waves, just like you can fly over everything.
It uses solar panels for the sensors, which I think, you could literally put a drone out there and it could run always, without any human intervention for years. It's amazing. I just think it, like you said, it's one of those things when you see it, you go, yeah, this has gotta been around for like 20 years and I just didn't realize it, but it's relatively new. It's pretty cool.
That's it for the news.
So in today's Web Corner, the Arctic Indigenous Peoples, Languages and Revitalization Map project has been released. This is a project that was a collaborative effort between many different countries that are involved with the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. It started originally as a project for a static map, and they realized that they wanted to create something that was more interactive, that included languages and what they call sleeper languages, or languages that they are trying to preserve in the spatial data set. So it's a pretty intensive map. It's very beautiful. So something to add to the Web Corner, just because they did do that transition. They realized that the original project they had in mind was good, but what they wanted to capture was actually something that you needed GIS for.
Well, I think this is related to GREG, which is I just forgot what GREG stands for, but it looks at languages around the world, and it's a data set that's always being updated in terms of what dominant and secondary and tertiary languages are spoken in an area. So I think this is related to that and focuses on, these Arctic areas that this map is focusing on.
Yeah, and they said if you look at the map and you see that there's a language missing, to please contact them and let them know so that they can add it to the spatial database.
Okay, so this week's topic is one that I think is about to become, and I'm not saying, again, I'm not going to say this year it's going to be something that's going to be a breakout or next year it's going to be a breakout, but I think it's something that, one, we're already doing, but also one that's going to continue to become more important in how we as geographers, spatial scientists, people who are presenting spatial information, it's just going to keep getting more and more relevant in how we present information because of the ways that the technology of how we're presenting information is different. And that's this idea of the story, but not just the story, because of course we talk about story maps, we talk about the various representations of narrative that relate to spatial information. But as we keep changing the way we share visual information, we're going to have to get better at creating these stories. And of course, we talk a lot about how video games and geospatial are going to come together and are coming together already. But I think that we focus a lot on the visual aspect of that. And while we do talk about the storytelling and design aspects of how we're going to be creating these moving video interactive narratives, we don't always talk about how we're going to drive people to better understand what we're trying to get them to look at in these, especially as we go into these very immersive open world type of representations. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about whether we talk about it as story, narrative. Sue's often used the term vignettes, storyboarding even, that we use in things from video to creating visual narratives and visual novels and video games. Basically just this idea of narrative design for geovisualization. And I think, we've all done it on some level as part of our dissertations or other projects. So I think we have a good group of people to talk about that story-driven nature, how we're telling a story, how we're telling a narrative, and these things now and in the future.
Okay, so I'm struggling with the terminology, and not because of, I think you did a good job of introducing the concept, but I think part of the problem is, Sue's use of the word vignette highlights that what's the nugget of the thing that we're actually trying to talk about here? Because story, unfortunately, has a lot of definitions and meanings, and narrative has a lot of definitions and meanings. And we've talked about, well, when I say we, I mean geography has talked about socially constructed narratives, power dynamic constructed narratives, and all that kind of philosophy stuff we can jump into. But I kind of think that the word that popped in my mind as you were talking through the idea is parable. So we use a story or a narrative to, like you said, get at the information, the knowledge, the thing that we want you to know, the nugget, for lack of a better word, of that, what we're trying to communicate. And I think that it is a way complicated issue. You're absolutely right, to figure out, how do I identify that? How do I encapsulate it? And how do I get you, the user, to interact with it first, to connect to it, and secondly, get anything out of it when you do, or thirdly, I should say. So that's it's a big ask, and it's really challenging. So I think you're right. I think it is going to be forthcoming critical thoughts about how to do that. But I agree. Like I say, this year or next year, or maybe not even this decade, who knows? But that is a big question. Did I re-say what you said using my own words? Is that accurate?
Kind of, but at the same time, just as some of the other terms that I used have problems or potentially are problematic in the discussion of it, of course, parable also brings its own history of how it's been used, even though it's a perfectly good way of describing it as well. So I don't know. Where do you? We still have two other people who have not yet talked about the idea of how we're going to design these narratives.
Well, I wasn't going to say how we design them, but when you were talking, I had been thinking about this because you've seen this growth. You've seen it almost really start to hit this past year, but you heard it earlier where I'd go into sessions where people from different organizations would be, advised, you need to create context for what you have. You need to tell a story about what you're doing. And that's going to be sometimes 30% of what you do from a project or research or work is conveying to the public, what it is you've done. And I think this is an outgrowth of that you see, not just with story maps, but just the idea of the spatial narrative, no matter what tool you use, of having to create a context for the maps that you've created. And if you do that, then you need to know how to create a cohesive, like you said, a story. And you need to know how to do it correctly, so that people can follow along with what your intent is, what your story is, what your project is, or what the news is. And you see a lot more jobs requiring these type of spatial narratives beyond just creating the map. And it's like they're separate skill sets, but related, that might be asking a lot of someone to know how to do that. And like you said, I think there needs to be training for it. What would it include? I think it needs to include some of the things that people learn for digital media, or storytelling, spatial narratives, history, geography. I'm pulling now people I know that already work with narrative.
Well, I mean, I think that this is something that I've worked with in struggle for years. And I do think that one big part of this is that when we look at the different technologies in geovisualization, right, as you know, Barb, you were kind of talking about maps and story maps, kind of that thing. And then, you know, Jesse, I think your introduction was a little more general, and I have evolved to approach it from a very specific implementation, a very specific set of technologies and goals. And while I think some parts of the storytelling and story construction, and by the way, just as a little aside, Pixar has available a really neat little course called I can't think it's called The Art of Storytelling, or maybe we'll find the links for it, that looks at some of these things, whether it's something that you're doing in what we'll call it a nonfiction or professional thing, or a fictionalized story, right? That there are elements that are the same. And so I think, though, that one of the things as geographers, as scientists, as maybe technical people, that's it right there. We kind of approach these as trying to get our information out. And so the goal there is to get X, Y, and Z to an audience, right? But I think that becomes complicated in the technologies we're now working in. And so where I've kind of focused in that, in the immersive worlds, right? And we're involved in that. In the immersive world, the journey is just as important as the end, right? And maybe sometimes more so. And so in that, you have to accept you may not get your user to the same end that you would get to. And so that's the big struggle. And so this notion of constructing story and narrative can have really different looks based on what your goal is, or even the mechanism in which you're going to have it happen. And so I think this is just, you know, me thinking one of the things that those of us who are on the science end of things maybe struggle with is that notion, that perception and emotion. We've talked about this many times on the podcast, and others have as well. And there's a lot of work out there on that. But the thing that experience-based and storytelling that involves emotion, right, does is kind of play to those things, and maybe doesn't worry so much about all the facts along the way or all the little bits, because you're trying to have people experience in the moment.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're definitely going right into, when you're talking about emotion, we're going right into a lot of my work on my dissertation. So without getting too far down that, you know, rabbit hole, that you know, you're teasing at ideas of phenomenology and things like that, is that, you know, we, the user, bring our own experiences and life knowledge and all of the things that are embedded in that to any experience, all experiences. And one of the side effects of that is that when we're telling a story, my interpretation and my experience of that story is going to be colored, for lack of a better word, by my own experience. And so you're right. Part of the trick here is to get back to Jesse's initial question, is how do we get the user to glean, I don't know if that's the right word or not, but the story, the narrative, the information, the knowledge that we're wanting them to, the intention. And when we're talking about experiential, it gets even worse because how do we, the word that popped in my head was sanitize, and I don't like that word, but how do we incorporate, I guess, their colorization from their own experience into that so that they get that out of it? And I don't know that there's an answer to that problem. I just think it's an opportunity to put a positive spin on it, but also a challenge to be acknowledged and factored in at some level.
I was going to say, when you use the word sanitize, that's something I heard. I went to a storytelling virtual workshop recently, and it was for nonfiction, and they were talking about the fact that a lot of times in the past we have cleaned things up so much we've sanitized them, but like Sue was saying, to tell a story means to tell people about the messy parts and about the challenges, and to basically humanize what you're doing in yourself before you go into everything else. And I think that would be, that's a small part of creating a spatial narrative. But I thought that humanization was, something that they focused on, and that I think we've been talking a little bit about.
Well, I think in this may be controversial, but one of the things that I've begun to come around to in doing some of this work is taking a look at those, and again, by no means, one of the only people doing this. Like there's tons of really good stuff about this, but trying to get at what successful storytellers do and creators. And so looking at filmmaking a little bit more. So I've started to look a little bit at story design. And so Jesse mentioned storyboarding, the idea of an interesting analogy, like from storyboarding, right? The idea of framing experience, which is what comics books do, which a lot of visual representations of story do, right? The idea of framing experience, the window or the lens that you're looking through as the creator, right? That shows your reader, your user, your player, your audience, whatever. But that letting go a little bit from the complete worry of how the user, like how I want to get to the end user, and just thinking, well, how would I construct the story from a creator's side, right? To have ownership of that creation end of it, and learning a little bit more about that. And I think that's an area where maybe, as researchers, as scholars, as professionals and stuff, maybe we struggle with a little bit, that it's okay to inject a little bit of that into what we do. Maybe not even a little bit, maybe a lot. And that maybe that's an area where, we can go, because we've all, seen amazing presentations and demos and projects where it just, you walk through this brilliant, visualization and stuff, but there's no dynamism, right? Nothing's going on, and it's accurate and it's all these other things, but, maybe where's that next step?
And I think, Sue, this is, what they were saying is missing from, the artificial intelligence talk we did last time, is that people are looking for the authentic voice. They don't want it to be perfect. They want it to be in your voice and in your experience. I've heard it from different agencies where they say, I want to hear the blood and guts of the story. I don't need it to sound perfect or sound like everyone else. Just sound like yourself.
And I think that is an example of where we have somewhat diverging concepts here between where we are now and I think where we're going. Is that right now, we're talking about stories, and we've always been telling visual stories through maps, and there's been the very strong adoption of story maps, both from just from multiple directions, open source, not open source, and otherwise, and they're focused on telling a story. But I think we're moving into areas where there's some story. And this is where we're going to get into the game narrative example, that there are story elements, but there are broader narratives that you can experience, going back around to Frank's kind of allusion to, or not even allusion to, but description of phenomenology in this, where you're bringing your own experience and your own desire to explore portions of the landscape. It's the comparison of, we had Google Maps in 2004, 2005, and people were going to it and they were looking for their house. And then we had the ability to create timelines in Google Maps where you could take people through a series of locations. And we've, duplicated that in all different software at this point, where we can either just zoom in and out of a place or follow through in a presentation mode, whether it's a story map or I can't remember what Google called that.
The tour.
The tour, thank you. And so the one is someone choosing locations and destinations to tell a story. But I think we're moving into a world where, whether we're talking about augmented reality, virtual reality, just straight up, experiential areas as we're moving through, we can now bring up guided directions on our watch. We will have more than that with audio eventually. And really, we have some of that in terms of storytelling now, but eventually we might have more vignettes based or parable based descriptions as you walk by somewhere. It just pops up. It's not part of a larger story. It's just a little thing that you hit. And so there's these different aspects of the narrative, this broader narrative, that we may not be telling a story, but it provides a context for which you're looking at things. And so I think, that's one of the things I kind of want to see where we're going in the future. And again, it's one of those things that we're not really at yet in the context. It's a very meta experiential approach of looking at this, where we're trying to understand how we're building our own story as part of the narrative, along with these story elements that we are provided. I don't know. Sorry. Everybody's kind of looking at me now.
No, but this is actually, no, it's because I'm thinking through this, and it's reminding me, and there's many, many analogies that you could use for this, but it's reminding me. So, yes, I'm an old, but some of you remember this. There was an episode of Star Trek. I'm trying to remember what the guy was called.
Which
he was
Star
like
Trek?
Which
the
one?
original Star Trek.
Oh, okay.
Right,
OG.
where they show up at the giant library, and the guy was like the curator or something, but like he could pull out memories, like, and there's the pensieve, all that kind of stuff, and other things, but that notion, the vignette idea, comes out of stuff like that, right? That within a landscape, within anything, right? That there's embedded these many experiences that are triggered by you, like as you're experiencing it, by you seeing something, by you trying to solve a problem, whatever those are. And now more and more, kind of like I'm working through this mentally, but the visual analogy that's coming into my mind is that guy, the old guy that was the museum curator or whatever, and he would pull out his little discs with memories, and you could jump into them, right, and then relive that thing. And I was trying to remember like the specific episode or whatever, but
So the holodeck before the holodeck.
Yeah, but that was it, right? You just plugged it into the machine, and then you could jump into that memory, and they were trying to find the right one. So I'm butchering my summary of that particular episode after having seen it like a million times. So, but I mean, like, it's an interesting analogy because, again, I think maybe what we struggle with in terms of structure for as creators, right, of these things is we struggle for a metaphor for how to structure things to get what we want for our experiencers, right? Our users. Maybe experiencers is a long, annoying way to say it. But we go from sometimes wanting the data to speak for itself, right, with very little structure, to wanting the opposite end of it, right? A linear, maybe even. I need you to see step 1 before you see step 2, and you're panning around the map order, which kind of like Google or Tours, or kind of story map presentation, whatever they are kind of like that. And so there's a huge range in between there. But it is, right? We have to have the framework of how we see as the creator, somebody going through that. So.
But also, as you were saying when you were talking about you're going to say something that's the antithesis of how it's been done, I was thinking, the way that you learn that you're presenting one story, but like Jesse said with the beginning of Google Maps, Where is my house? This idea that we'd somehow be able to create personalized or individualized stories, like the person viewing it comes from their lens, even though it's the same spatial narrative, the same spatial data, but how it's like, they said, do I have to do a story for every person? But I can imagine a time when we can have a story that's personalized to every person. I don't know how it would work, but I think that we have the technology now to do that.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about specifically stories, and again, that's not.
Well, I'm using stories, but I don't even. I mean, your vignette idea or just.
Yeah, but I mean,
content.
These are all story elements as opposed to allowing that larger narrative to take place. But for those, this is where the AI comes in. This is where, those type of generative capabilities begin to come into the storytelling process. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely technologies there to support that approach.
So I had 3 thoughts through this. One was, I sort of felt like we were talking about side quests without using the phrase side quest.
Interject Frank each other too and say that was literally what's in the back of my head based on a conference question I got a few years ago. So absolutely.
Yeah. So, and this is completely colored by the fact that we got Diablo 4 this last week and I've been, playing it, and it's, filled with side quests, as that type of game will be. The second thought I had was, there's another game that we've played a lot in the past called 7 Days to Die, which is a sandbox open world zombie game. And it's been in alpha for years, like a decade and a half. I mean, it's a really long time. They've been developing this, very small team. And they keep revising the game because people keep playing it wrong from their point of view, because it's a sandbox game and you can kind of do what you want, and they want this experience to be a certain way, and people just aren't doing it that way. So they keep changing things to try to get people to do it the quote unquote right way. And I thought that's a really interesting real world example of some of these questions, right? Is that as creators, we're seeking the desire to get something communicated, knowledge or a feeling or emotion or, whatever it may be. And that's not any radically different than somebody who wrote a novel 150 years ago or composed a piece of music or, painted a picture. They were communicating something about themselves, right? They had a thought, they had a feeling, they had some sort of emotion maybe, whatever. And they put it into their art, and they hope that you feel something similar. And there's always that, again, back to the phenomenology thing, there's always that translation layer where maybe you get it, maybe you don't. Maybe you connect it in a different way. Maybe you don't connect to it whatsoever. So that was my second thought. My third was, and this sort of leads from the art sort of statement, is how is this really fundamentally different than maps? So, I've been saying for years, and I'm not the only person, I just got it from somebody, I don't remember who, but every map tells a story, right? So, and what we include, as we know as GIS people, is that, no data, no geography. What we choose to include in our map is going to color dramatically on how people interpret that map and what they get out of it. And that's been a lot of the early critiques of GIS, is that this was done in a nefarious way or for specific political reasons or whatever it may be. And I was thinking, well, I wonder how this is really different than a map. It's a thicker thing. It's a more complicated thing. It's a more involved thing to tell a story, because there's a lot more elements involved in it. But really, even when I show you a map that's supposed to ideally lead you to a particular interpretation, you may take that and go, oh, I didn't know this information was over here, and then this means that, and I can link it into the stuff that I know and use your map that's supposed to show coastline erosion and show places that I can make golf courses. I mean, whatever. I'm being facetious here, throwing something out, but we don't know that people can use it. There's no way to enforce the utilization of a map. People are going to take with what they will from it. And so we've kind of been dealing with this issue forever, really. I'm not sure if it's quite as obvious as when we're trying to tell a story, because the story feels much more complicated, I think.
So I agree that it is the same as a map, because we're still talking about geovisualization. A map is a geovisualization. These interactive maps, these 3D maps, these augmented experiences, they're all a type of map. And so, yeah, these are things we've been grappling with for a very long time. I think my question isn't new, but I think it is tied to the multidimensionality of this. And not just multidimensionality, but also eventually we're going to get more and more into multimedia. And we are kind of already, but we're still focusing very heavily on visual, but we're going to get, as we've talked about many times, we're going to get sound that's going to work better. We're going to get eventually potentially smell, for better or worse. All these different things that are going to continue to add layers. So yeah, it's not a new question. It's just a question that keeps getting bumped out as we add more dimensions, more data, more detail, more media, and all these other things.
And I think I'm going to use because I'm also recently revisiting a lot of this, because I too am playing through a video game which has gotten a lot of attention and is very popular. So the new Legend of Zelda is called Tears of the Kingdom, and it follows on the heels of another one called Breath of the Wild. But interestingly, this game brings up a lot of these types of things. So unlike some very linear driven, so if those of you thinking the attention, a lot of the games that we've talked about in the past from studios like Naughty Dog that are very much cinematic and linear, right? It's reasonably clear the story they're trying to tell you. Two more open world games like the zombie game you mentioned, Frank. So these recent Zelda games are somewhat in the middle, in that there is a larger narrative happening, right? A series of events in which you as Link will play a big role. But the structure of it is very nonlinear. And I was thinking, as we were talking about some of that, is this actually has geoglyphs in it. So it's an interesting connection to landscape and all that. But one of the interesting things is that the way you understand what your role in this larger narrative going on almost in the background, the way you understand your role is through little vignettes. And they're, in this case, they're memories that you can access by visiting different locations in the world. But they're snippets. And here's the other part of that, is that there is necessarily no clue as to which a particular order, right? They do take place chronologically if you have all of them. But they provide you the story of what has been happening to bring you to where you are. And one of the things about both of these games, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, right, is that you essentially awake with little or no memory of what had previously taken, so like what's happening. And the story here is very emergent. So the notion of emergent narrative that Jenkins a while back, talked about, one of the things about video games is you have to construct the narrative as you move through the space of the gameplay. And in this case, it is I find it, so this is my personal take on it, although I'm enjoying playing the game, I find it incredibly frustrating that I have little to no guidance. So it is very much like, say, something like a story map or a Google Maps, where I go around these locations and information either comes to me or I take actions that help me find out. But here's the thing, I can play this game, and I did with the first one. I still haven't completed it, as it were, and not really know any sense of urgency to my final goal. The sun shines, it rains, like the days go by, and the people seem reasonably unperturbed about the fact that the world might be ending. And so I never get some of those other emotional things to suggest that I'm involved in something that potentially literally is having world-changing effects. And I thought about that design, and a lot of people like it. And there's a lot of analysis over the meaning behind it and stuff. But it's interesting, right? That take on it is very much that question of if I'm creating an immersive experience, and we still struggle, I think, or are uncomfortable with how much guidance to give somebody, how much of our own perspective, right? How much of our own worldview to inject into these stories to guide it. And filmmakers and, those who write literature, comic book creators, video game designers, right, struggle with this. And I think that it's still a fairly new thing for us in the immersive geovisualization world to kind of really contemplate this as a thread running through our project designs.
And I think part of what I was trying to get to at the very beginning with the to use your example there is that, we have the primary storyline, we have the side quests, but in these games, we are spending more time between any of those than we are in the main storyline or in the side quest.
It's the Equiano thing. There's a famous book by a gentleman named Equiano. I can't remember his first name. And he was a slave that was captured in West Africa in the 19th century and was brought over to the Caribbean. And he basically traveled between that and Boston, South Carolina, and Britain. At some point, he earned his freedom, and he ended up traveling all through those regions again. And he wrote, I think it's 9 chapters. It's available on the internet for free, so you can read this book if you're interested in it. And he talks about his life, his experience in the 9 chapters from being captured until the end of his life. In the last chapter of his life, he's sort of reflecting on it. It's a really interesting book. But when you take all those places that he mentions, the number one place that shows up like by far in his book is the ship. And they're all different ships, because it was one ship as he came over as a captured slave, and then he was a successful merchant over the years in his life. And all the ship existence is the dominant place in his discussions. So I interjected with that rather lengthy discussion. Yeah, it's the in-between that mattered the most to him when you think about what does he talk about the most. He talks about the boat, the ocean. That's what he talks about the most.
So I think, we really kind of talked a lot about some of the ideas that, not specifically tying them back to last podcast, but I think a lot of it does inherently kind of tie into where we're going with some of these technologies, and where we are now with things like story maps and traditional hard maps, and moving into these more narrative based. Again, they've always been narrative based, as Frank pointed out, but just deeper stories can be told because you're spending more time with them, I think. And that's not even true. I mean, we've all spent hours with just a tiny little map in the back of a car sometimes, doing the exact same thing that we're just talking about, doing it even deeper now with new media.
Do you have any idea how many hours I spent with the Ultima map that came in the Cloth Ultima map in the video game back, and just looking at it and imagining, so.
Yeah.
Well, but I think too, and I don't think that everyone needs to, raise it if it's not your thing, but I think it's okay to want to own your creating process, right? That you don't have to feel that you're somehow less rigorous, or, that you're, essentially taking a stand with maybe an emotional approach or something like that. I think that there are times when that is appropriate, and that it's okay to look to some of these other creative fields to see how they do it and how they do it successfully. And I think that's maybe we're still not at enough of us aren't at a comfort level for that yet.
I think we should have a further podcast topic about that very issue, because there are subdisciplines of geography, not to mention many other disciplines, but specifically subdisciplines of geography that are very comfortable with the notion of a pointed positional narrative, and that they interject themselves and that they're part of that dialogue. And I think that some of this that you're talking about is some of where we come from, the more that kind of more scientific, the data is the data, hands off, present facts, draw your own conclusions, that kind of approach, philosophy, the positivism, basically. But that's a whole longer conversation I think we should have at some point.
Ironically, we have been for almost 2 decades now, creators, and yet we still fall back to, this expectation. But if you look at anything on YouTube, or anyone who's doing a creative enterprise, not discipline, but enterprise right now, I think they would be much more comfortable. And you can look at some of the younger YouTubers and such that are geography degree holders. And, they very much are, as you're saying, more comfortable inserting themselves in the narrative that they're creating.
Well, and I think, and again, I agree with Frank. I think this is a separate conversation, but I also think comfortable. Like, for example, if just imagine 10 years ago, if we said, well, take a look at how Pixar does things, or check out this thing on the top 10 things, and that a filmmaker thinks about when they're framing shots or something like that. I think that there'd be very few people that in our fields then that would have went, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Yeah. I mean, I just think that but there were, like Frank says, there actually were people, but I think that, maybe we were further apart then. And this is just my experience in, coming around to this now that there are aspects in the creation process that I can definitely learn. And now I'm fine with going and looking rather than saying, no, I must make it work within the theoretical frameworks that we already have, that we have, or we're working through from the other end. And now I'm like, no, I'm going to check this out, and I'm going to see how this is done.
You just look at our dissertation advisor, right? He never said serious games. He was serious games. That there was a definite emphasis, and it was the first word and the second word. If we could just not say it, that would be fine. So,
well, it always makes me think, what have we been saying whenever anyone says, we're an art and a science, and you hear that quoted a lot, but at the same time, not giving, worth to the creative side as much as the science side.
And some of that's because we went for a PhD, and that kind of, in at least the people we worked with, was very much more of the art and science crowd. Even
though the science is more art than we're comfortable with admitting.
Yeah, well, I think you also find that in the professional field a lot of times, because people don't, again, they're not thinking about what they do as being creative, as bringing part of themselves into it. And they do, but and it's just sometimes we have to reframe it because we don't think of ourselves that way.
Like I said, bigger discussion. Very, very good topic for us to talk about in the not too distant future.
Yeah. Okay. On to the event corner. As always, if you'd like to find out more about these events and others, head over to this to hear about us talk about them.
First up, the 2023 NYGeoCon annual conference and the first annual National Geospatial Golf Classic. Is that really true?
I'm not sure, because Geo always had golf. Yeah. So I guess maybe the name is new.
Well, it's just admitting it, and now I want to go for obvious reasons.
Yeah, it's not to be missed. Yeah. It'll be September 24th through the 29th in lovely New Orleans, Louisiana.
Good food, and you get to play golf, and you get GIS. Why would you not want to do that? That's like a three-fer.
Et c'est le bon temps roulé.
The NYGeoCon 2023 is taking place September 25th to the 27th in Albany, New York, if you want to not go to the Geospatial Golf Classic.
INTERGEO 2023 is taking place October 10th through 12th in Berlin, Germany.
Of course, if you'd like us to add your event to the podcast, send us an email to podcast@veryspatial.com.
If you'd like to reach us individually, I can be reached at sue@veryspatial.com.
I'm Barb at VerySpatial.com.
I'm Frank at VerySpatial.com.
And I'm available at Jesse at VerySpatial.com. And of course, you can find all of our contact information over at VerySpatial.com/contacts.
As always,
we're the folks from VerySpatial.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you in a couple weeks.